I don't know if I told you yet. Kelly and I are doing we have a gym membership now. So like, I've I've never, I didn't do athletics in high school, so I never had a weight room. There was always the home gym down in my unfinished basement in the Ashton house. But like, I'm now
You've never been
going,
a gym.
huh?
You've never been a gym member.
Other than like when it's even Salisbury, like I could have used the facilities there, but I'm like fucking the slackerest slacker, that takes a walk jog class to just like walk to get that credit. So now I'm like actually trying to take my body a little bit more seriously and like actually lift weights. I think I feel like I told you this before, related to like the chin up bar conversation.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm anyway, that doesn't matter. I'm driving home from this barbell class this morning, and I'm listening to the Johns Hopkins curated like ketamine playlist for ketamine infusion sessions, and I'm listening to this track. It's some opera. It's not a classic. It's a modern opera, and it's so reliably moving. The last time I listened to it, it was kind of like I was sort of curating the list before the first time using ketamine. And I'm just like sitting on my couch, not multitasking, not unloading, just fully immersed in, have headphones on, over the ear headphones. And the song brings me to tears. and then so I'm on my way home this morning.
You're like, I need some more testosterone.
No, quite the opposite, actually. Of like, the song reliably opens my heart, and it's like this, it's a grief response. It's like, there's tears of joy, and then there's tears of mourning and loss, and mixed with knowing that we're going to be talking about the topic that we're going to be talking about. This song is just like the images that you see of the conflict, much less the atrocities, the original atrocities. By the way, when I say original, I just mean October 7th. Of course, there were atrocities prior, but yeah, just it's such a powerful and helpless feeling to not even contend with. It's not fighting the emotion, but just allowing the emotion to flow over you, and realizing how much suffering and how much loss and how unbearable it is, and how we as U.S. citizens are basically and I want to hear from you. I'm rambling, and we're jumping in. We're coming in out here, I guess, but most U.S. citizens are, they're either not paying attention or they are. And, to what degree can you do something when the Atlantic Ocean is between you and you're just watching the images? If your job isn't directly related to the conflict, if you're not, of course, a journalist or, in foreign affairs or government positions. So it's just, I felt this sadness and this helplessness, and not just the Israel Palestine conflict, or in particular Hamas, but just all, just, it's like conflict begets conflict begets conflict. And you think about Boko Haram, or you think about failed states in in Libya or Yemen or these, and it just gets overwhelming. And then of course it's just like, oh, how am I okay, I just got to come back into the present moment. I'm driving in my Honda and I have like an interview, but like, I'm not making any sense right now. I'm speaking for the overwhelm, I guess, that it's when you're in that emotional state of like helplessness and grief on behalf of people that lose their children, or the ambiguous loss of the hostages that are taken. You don't know if can you hope that they're still alive? And anyway, please stop me from rambling, please.
There's a lot of that feeling, not just among Americans watching it or Americans who have connection to it or people internationally, but Israelis and Palestinians. Obviously, I can more accurately present the Israeli side of things, especially, regarding October 7th. A feeling of helplessness is certainly predominant. They talk about how many Israelis have suffered like secondary trauma, in a large part because not just from losing family members or people they knew, but seeing the images online. And actually I've read that people engage with these images and these videos a lot because out of a feeling of helplessness, like it makes them feel like they're doing something to be part of it in some ways. And I can understand that, because I'm like, why am I watching these graphic videos? In a sense, it's sometimes I feel like I have to watch them to be exposed to the reality, both not just October 7th, but the war in Gaza. But the helplessness in general animates Israelis and Palestinians right now. Israelis, as far as like, how did we allow October 7th, the worst day in Israel's history, to happen in 2023, 50 years after the Yom Kippur War? And then Palestinians, how is the world, from their perspective, how's the world allowing so many innocent civilians to be killed? Now over 25,000 people killed in Gaza, not all of them innocent civilians, of course. Roughly 9,000 or so are actually Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and other militants. But certainly the loss of life on both sides is catastrophic.
Yeah. I wanted to talk to you about, there's like several territories. I appreciate what you're saying, and there's several areas of the current state of affairs between these two states. I mean, I'm going to introduce you in the pre-roll, and so listeners who are not familiar with your academic bona fides will know a little bit about that. But I'm wondering if you maybe could start by just helping our audience know what informs your background, when like, how did you think about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict prior to October 7th and after? Because it's been going on since before we were even conceived, right? Like, it's been going for a long time.
Well, it's notable you mentioned the academic part of my experience, because the first major thing I did on that front was my undergraduate thesis, which was about Hamas. And I even met with like supporters of Hamas, Americans,
and what year? What year?
This was 2007. So after Hamas had taken power in Gaza, and after the election, and then the coup against the Palestinian Authority in Gaza, so they had complete control of Gaza. And after the blockade had been initiated by Israel, and the demands had been given by the international community that Hamas would have to meet in order to have recognition.
Yeah, so because I hate to be the Luddite here, but just there are probably listeners that don't need to go into this, and I know there will be listeners who do. Just for me, kind of Joe Schmo, when you say take power and you say there's an election but also a coup.
Hamas first of all, Israel had settlements and complete occupation of Gaza from the 1967 war, or after the 67 war, until 2005, when they withdrew unilaterally from Gaza and evacuated the settlements there, which was a major event in Israeli society. And after that, there were elections held in Gaza under the auspices of the Palestinian Authority, which had been established by the Oslo Accords in the early 90s. Those elections were won by Hamas running under a different banner. It was called Truth and Reconciliation. But everyone understood they were affiliated with Hamas. And this wasn't just an election in Gaza, it was throughout the Palestinian territories in West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem. So Gaza won. These were parliamentary elections. So Gaza then won the majority of seats in parliament. They did become part of the Palestinian government that was short-lived, because then there were, I won't go into the whole background of how this events leading up to this, but eventually there was armed conflict in Gaza between Fatah, the main party that is the party of Mahmoud Abbas, who was the head of the Palestinian Authority, head of the PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization, which represents Palestinians worldwide and in negotiations, and Hamas pretty swiftly overthrew them and kicked most of them out from Gaza, and took control of Gaza and made it kind of their own territory that they now governed. They went from being just a kind of terrorist and civil society group to being also a governing authority inside of Hamas, still with also figures and power centers outside of Gaza, including in the West Bank, but much of their leadership and then the ruling authority now in Gaza. Then soon after that, actually no, prior to that, the first war occurred in which that Hamas made use of tunnels that were going into, they had dug under the territory leading into Israel. And by the way, the first tunnels were built at least in the 80s, if not going back further. And this extensive network had started. Now you have an absolutely massive network that we're learning more and more about every day underneath Gaza. But they used an attack tunnel leading into Gaza to stage an attack against an Israeli position, killed a couple of soldiers and abducted one. And he was then in captivity inside Gaza for 5 years, if I remember correctly.
And what year are we talking?
That was 2006. I know because I was actually in Israel on a birthright trip. I was in Jerusalem there were soldiers on our trip. We started getting calls about what had happened. Very soon after that, there was the first war with Hamas in Gaza. And also 10 days after that, a war with Hezbollah began. Not directly connected to that, had to do with, but a similar kind of attack where Israeli soldiers there was an attack on the northern border, and the bodies of the Israeli soldiers who were killed were abducted into Lebanon. Anyway, with this was the Gilad Shalit kidnapping by Hamas. 5 years later, he was eventually exchanged for over 1,000 Palestinian prisoners, one of whom was Yahya Sinwar, who is the current head of Hamas in Gaza and also the mastermind of the October 7th attack.
Yeah. By the way, just a note on him. I was listening to the Sam Harris's Making Sense podcast, also in anticipation of our conversation, and I didn't realize Sam Harris, philosopher, famous atheist, neuroscientist, or he's saying like Sinwar his life was saved by a Jewish oncologist when he was in, I can't remember what hospital or whatever, but like I don't remember the context. I just listened to this 2 hours ago, but it's just to think that a Jew saved his life and then he's released, and
family members of other Hamas leaders. It's been some situation. Now, other people might argue, okay, well, come on, Gaza doesn't have the capability, the technology, the resources to do that. But still, I mean, I agree with the point you're making there. There's always interconnectivity with these populations. I mean, Sinwar himself while he was in prison for 2 decades, I think at least 2 decades, he learned Hebrew and considers himself an expert on Israeli society.
But to the point you were making is like this prisoner swap. It's like, oh, okay, we're gonna get this guy back, and then release 1,000. I mean,
well, in many ways, it was the seeds of what happened, both in terms of Sinwar becoming the leader and also this just further ratification of this strategy to free Palestinian prisoners. This has become his life's mission, is to free all Palestinian prisoners. Obviously, of course, the Hamas mission of destroying Israel is the long-term strategic goal, but for him, this was always his primary motive. So, something like nobody ever, besides the horrific nature of the attack, the amount of people killed on October 7th, nobody ever could foresee this amount of hostages being taken. I mean, again, 1,000 people for one
soldier.
This was one soldier, and this whole issue animated, a lot of Israeli society for a number of years, and there were major campaigns. And then outside of Israel, that was one soldier. There were over 200 soldiers and civilians taken on October 7th. There are still 136. We don't know how many of them are alive. At least 30 are dead. Hostages remaining in Gaza right now. Yeah. Not to mention the fact that it included women and children and elderly, that kind of dynamic that nobody ever could have foreseen.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I've been thinking about this, the difference between, what's happening now in the landscape, the context, the technological context that it's happening in, humans have been committing evil against one another since the dawn of our species.
Mm-hmm.
But we have a technological interconnectivity with regards to like cell phone video footage and social media. And so you have young, the youth of many countries that are like, I'm watching a genocide. Like, you know what I mean? That in a way that didn't happen.
There's multiple ways it's affecting. I mean, one kind of what you're mentioning is the live streaming of atrocities on October 7th itself.
By the way, I should say, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I do want to make the clarifying point that when I'm quoting this fictitious, or the teen who's on TikTok and saying I'm watching a genocide, I do want to be clear that any genocide that I'm talking about is the Hamas's attempt to exterminate the Jews. I think that's something we'll get into later, maybe, but the myth that Israelis are being charged with, or that they are trying to commit a genocide on a people. I just we'll table that for later in our conversation. But go ahead, I interrupted you.
Yeah, they were right that terminology is being as widespread, and the live streaming genocide is you're hearing that terminology. But there is live streaming of mass killing. Among Palestinians, you see, footage of people being killed on the ground in Gaza, the casualties of Israeli bombings and other military actions. But on October 7th, I mean, and also there's the issue of fake footage or footage from other conflicts that's being attributed to this footage, and people having to debunk that or demonstrate that was from years ago or from some different source. There's also the use of psychological warfare by Hamas, not just the continued videos of military action, but videos of the hostages. A couple of weeks ago, they released footage saying, or showing 3 hostages and saying, 2 of them have been hurt, and we'll reveal their fate tomorrow. And then the next day they say, oh, well, 2 of these have been killed, and they were killed by Israeli airstrikes. And, maybe they were killed by Israeli airstrikes, but it's at least as likely, if not more, that they were just killed by Hamas for whatever reason. But I can tell you on October 7th, my personal experience of finding out what was happening was I was up at 2 a.m. and just happened to look at my phone, saw all these alerts from Twitter that were like just mind blowing, what I was seeing, because it was like missiles fired and then just like Hamas fighters roaming the streets of Sderot, the major Israeli city near Gaza in the south of Israel. Hamas parading body of dead soldier inside Gaza, all of this coming at me at once, and the attack was still like as I was seeing this, it was still in the midst of really the beginning stages of this attack. So I was looking on Twitter and seeing in live time, what the images Hamas were sending out was, some of them were breaking into the kibbutzim where they would commit these terrible massacres. And you almost had this, speaking of the feeling of helplessness, I mean, like I was like, had almost the feeling like wanting to warn the the people like in the kibbutz, this is happening right now. You're seeing it on
And,
Twitter.
and I might not mention this in the pre-roll, but it should be known for folks who don't know. It's not just an academic interest and your educational experience and occupational experience that you lived. You mentioned the birthright trip, but that was 2006. You lived in Israel from which years? Like just to contextualize.
End of 2018 until the beginning of 2022.
Mm-hmm.
And actually around that time, I was traveling in the South, and I went to 4 of the sites, we could say 4 or 5 of the sites that were attacked on October 7th. So I'm one of the kibbutzim, the Erez crossing, where Palestinians passed through the border between Israel and Gaza, Zikin Beach, where an amphibious assault by Hamas occurred, Sderot, that's a major city I mentioned before, Ashkelon, which is another major city that's to the north of Gaza. So I'm very familiar. I could easily imagine being in those places, not to mention the amount of times that me and my wife traveled to the south, not necessarily to the Gaza area, but you pass through some of those roads because Hamas was just like parading up and down the road, shooting cars that were traveling on the highway.
Yeah, intimately familiar with. I mean, that's what sets your direct experience apart from your garden variety U.S. citizen who's tapped into the events that were unfolding. I myself, and I've talked about this before on the show, I was at a training, and whenever I'm like traveling or I'm out of town, I purposely use that as a news cleanse and just like unplug and tap out of the news cycle. And so for me, catching up with all of it, I was talking to my dad. My parents were out of the country, and my mom and dad were like, "Oh, did you hear about what happened?" And I'm like, "Yeah, isn't that?" I kind of like, maybe I sounded flippant. I was like, "Isn't there always a crisis between Israel and Palestinians? So what's new?"
Well, I think a lot of people initially were like, "Okay, this is another war." Even at night, I was turned on CNN, and the mainstream media report, the CNN report, of course, it was still like airport CNN, this was again the middle of the night. They were just talking about massive missile barrage into Israel, and there was an unprecedented level of, this provided cover for the attack. I think roughly like 3,000 missiles fired in the first hour, and I'm sitting watching what's happening on Twitter, like the real story of what's happening. Like there are thousands at that time. We had no idea of Hamas fighters on the ground inside Israel, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and
not to mention UNRWA employees. Now we know. Which is
I think the pretty limited involvement there. I think and they're part of UNRWA being in Gaza means that they're going to have a connection to the ruling authority and be infiltrated by Hamas on some level. But considering how many employees UNRWA has, it's a pretty low level. But I just at that point, the idea of 100, 200 after the first day Israeli casualties was already mind blowing, and then it just kept doubling as the days went on. And we realized, right away, it was an unprecedented event. It was already one of the worst days in Israel's history, and it was just insane that it could happen when that Israel could allow it to happen.
Yeah. Well, and and we're having this conversation in the end of January, and so you're talking about your experience in the hours and days following and how you were metabolizing all of that. I'm kind of curious, Aaron, your perspective about just how do I ask this question? Like, what's been your reaction to, and just speak, I guess, about the U.S. society's, not the government, not government position, but just civilians, the U.S. culture, basically, and how people are talking about the conflict and talking about, whenever you have talking heads on TV and they're saying, oh, well, they should do this or they should do that, or I'm curious of your perspective, as the months have gone on, like how not just social media, but legacy media, mainstream media, how the narratives about the conflict are, shifting and changing throughout different policy decisions or events, or when hostages come are released. And I mean, anything. And there's so many pathways into this. I'm curious about when you listen to the released hostages that are getting interviewed. I'm just curious at an emotional level, like how you're experiencing the unfolding of since October 7th to now. And there's really many bites at the apple that you can take here. Just wherever your mind associates to. But I'm very curious.
Yeah, well, I mean, I could divide it into emotional and intellectual response. I mean, emotionally, it's certainly been very difficult. Just not even talking about October 7th, but to see large parts of the left, the way they respond to this. And I have no problem with sympathizing with Palestinians or criticizing Israel, or even just taking more the side of Palestinians. People have the right to do that. But just to completely, on some level, completely adopt the Hamas narrative, or adopt the narrative of Israel being the settler colonial state, the genocide narrative, that that's taking this incredibly complicated conflict that has gone on for so many decades and simplifying it, and not to mention the infusion of anti-Semitism into so much of it, which seems to always occur with anything regarding Israel. And I'm not saying everyone who's critical of Israel is an anti-Semite or inherently anti-Semitic, but they just are so often bedfellows that it can't be ignored. And just the extent to which there's so little sympathy for the Israeli side on significant parts of the left, or even just like willing to hear the Israeli side. So that's been, dispiriting. But intellectually, I'm not that surprised by it, because having been involved in this issue with various NGOs over the years, and also for one of those NGOs, Americans for Peace Now, I ran the social media for them. So I saw a lot of the worst responses to various actions by Israel and the Palestinians.
Is there one that particularly stands out in your memory?
No, it's just a general trend of, Islamophobia on the right, and also anti-Israel and anti-Semitic elements on the left. Certainly, the rising anti-Semitism on the right is at least as problematic. But beyond that, I also, when I was in grad school, I was one of my teachers was Shibli Telhami, who's a professor at the University of Maryland, does major polling on a number of issues, but on American attitudes towards the conflict. And one thing when I was a grad student, this had just started to turn, the dynamic in which you were seeing more sympathy for Palestinians, more and more sympathy for Palestinians among Democrats, particularly younger people, whereas in the past it had always been a majority or plurality of people who said they didn't sympathize with either side. Now you had started to see on the right more sympathy with Israel, and then now more and more you're seeing more sympathy with Palestinians on the left. So it becomes, and it has also become one of these, like, everything is politicized and part of the polarization, the political polarization inside the US. And this is just another one of those issues that's like, you're on this side or on this side. And I've always tried to take a nuanced approach where I always say that I blame both sides equally for the conflict in general. You can divide each piece or each era and talk about who's more to blame. but there's always blame on both sides. There's even for October 7th, of course, Hamas is primarily to blame, but this is a result of a number of things on the Israeli side. For one, most importantly, Netanyahu's strategy ever since he reassumed the premiership in, what was it, 2007, 2008 now, and with a brief period a year or so ago where he was out of power. But his entire strategy in that time was his entire strategy all along, since he's been involved in politics, is to prevent a Palestinian state, to disrupt any possibility of a two-state solution. And over the past decade plus, he's used Hamas as an asset. In fact, some people in his current government have explicitly described Hamas as an asset in terms of keeping the West Bank and Gaza separate, both geographically and politically, maintaining Hamas in power as a rival to the Palestinian Authority, maintaining their governorship of Gaza while keeping Gaza isolated and just having periodic wars with Gaza. They thought the terms inside Israel, or the Israeli military and political figures, like mowing the lawn was one of them. That was we just have to have a war every year or so, and it can be low level, and then we just return to this status quo. And Netanyahu explicitly said the words, "We have to live by the sword forever." Just meant, again, periodic wars where we suffer low level casualties.
Why is that? I'm not following why that's an asset.
So maintaining Hamas power of Gaza isolated and two different polities in Gaza and the West Bank means you can't have a two-state solution, because you have a divided Palestinian government, you have divided Palestinian territory, and you have one group in power that explicitly rejects Israel's right to exist and has no interest in the two-state solution.
I see.
West Bank,
okay, from that perspective. Okay, now I'm with you. Okay.
So Hamas, he likes to criticize Qatar now for financing Hamas in recent years. Well, all that financing was approved and encouraged by his government to keep Hamas afloat in Gaza while Israel maintained the blockade. So this is a strategy that Netanyahu explicitly followed, and talk about blowback on October 7th. Who knew you couldn't just keep 2.5 million people blockaded in a small territory and think that you can just have a periodic low-level war and nothing's going to happen. I mean, they're keeping all these technological solutions supposedly to Hamas being able to deal any kind of major blow to Israel. So they had Iron Dome, which is the missile defense system, which in many ways there was blowback on that front, because it made Israel think that they were immune from major casualties, while also thinking that they didn't have to do anything or fear a significant Hamas attack. So you had Iron Dome, you had the fence around Gaza, which in recent years have been upgraded with state-of-the-art technology, and was built to a significant level underground with all these sensors to prevent tunnels. And Hamas at the end of the day just blew up the parts of the fence and drove right over it, and used various other means like paragliding, and also taking out guns and other sensors along the fence. So they were able to, with very relatively rudimentary means, take out those defenses.
Your point.
The other thing is
go ahead.
But also when we talk about Israeli, I don't know if culpability is the right word, but there was a sense in Israel that like I said, they could just live by the sword, but it'd be at the low level. Nothing had to be really done on the Palestinian front. You could just kind of ignore this issue. You don't need to reach a peace deal. A peace deal is hopeless with the Palestinians anyway. and we can just live like this and maintain the occupation, maintain the blockade of Gaza, and not have any major moves to lead to a fundamentally different situation. And you see that thinking in the Abraham Accords, the normalization agreements with the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, to some extent Sudan, and the strive for normalization with Saudi Arabia that was occurring just prior to October 7th, and which was part of the motivation by Hamas and the actors that are financing Hamas, Iran most primarily, to have something that disrupted that effort. These normalization agreements where Israel doesn't have to pay any price for getting normalized relations with these Arab states, and certainly doesn't have to do anything regarding the Palestinian issue. So they thought this is all, again, Netanyahu's ideology. We can have peace with the Arab world, calling it outside in peace, and eventually the Palestinians will just be forced to accept, whatever we tell them.
It's a gamble that didn't pay off. It was, I mean, you're talking about like, it's not that those security measures weren't just a couple steps back from what you just mentioned. You were sort of making the point that it's an illusion. I call it a gamble, but it's like you get comfortable with something that is really has faults, has flaws, has permeability. You were saying in jest, who knew that could have,
Well, on some level, Israel did know, but they didn't take the threat seriously. I mean, they had the intelligence that showed the full plans that Hamas had for infiltration, for taking out various defenses. They just didn't think they really had the capability to go through with it. Also, Hamas managed to fool Israeli government and intelligence into thinking that they were currently focused on governance and not on having any war with Israel. And Israel didn't take some of its own intelligence or its own people within the Israel Defense Forces seriously. I mean, there were these low-level largely female officers who are called spotters, on the border with Gaza. Actually, some of them were, I spoke about that birthright ship. Some of the soldiers who were with us were in those positions, and I heard personal experiences about it. They just had their eyes on cameras every day, and they saw the planning for it. They saw Hamas officials even like looking at them through the cameras and like knowing that they were there, being aware of what all the mechanisms were for protecting the border, and they tried to warn their superiors, and they weren't taken seriously. It was brushed off like this isn't going to happen, although there was clearly sexism involved in that, and a lot of these women were killed on October 7th and kidnapped. So yeah, and then you look at the comfort level with the fences that were there, not thinking that they could be overrun. You had a significant amount of the Israeli forces that were supposed to be at the bases outside Gaza, were at that time deployed in the West Bank, providing security for settlers because of growing violence in the West Bank that was already occurring prior to October 7th. And it's important to note that, since October 7th, prior to October 7th, you already had huge level of violence in the West Bank in terms of the amount of Palestinians being killed. Since October 7th, there have been hundreds of Palestinians killed in the West Bank. Again, some of them are terrorists and there are legitimate operations to take them out, but you've had also abuse by Israeli soldiers been recorded, but even more alarmingly, the behavior of the radical Israeli settlers. Not all of them are radical, but the particularly radical and violent Israeli settlers, a lot of whom are also in the army throughout the West Bank, acting with impunity, in some cases killing Palestinians. and just taking over land, driving Palestinians off their land, and just kind of unabashed way, taking advantage really of the situation after October 7th to advance their goal of taking over more land and, long term preventing any establishment of a Palestinian state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm hearing as I'm hearing everything you're saying, there's a part of my mind that's tracking, it's always like the problem solver part, or the one that like doesn't want to lose the historical context of all this. I came in emotionally hot at the top of our conversation about feeling helpless and sad on behalf of just as a fellow human being when we suffer loss. You're like, you want to mitigate. I mean, I'm in my occupation as a therapist, as a healer, largely the bigger umbrella is someone who helps people heal. You think about not just how do you prevent future harms from happening, but and how can you heal people now, but also like where does this all why is this all happening? And I think you mentioned, I can't remember what the context was, but you did mention, you used the word colonizer. That's part of, I think maybe after I was saying, what's your take on how the narratives have evolved since October 7th? And that's one of the ones I wanted to ask you about. These the Jews are colonizers and the Palestinians are indigenous people. History is not my strong suit, and I didn't pay attention in church when I was growing up, but I'm pretty sure. I'm trying to understand how that narrative gains any traction. So what you've no doubt heard that narrative, and I'm curious your response on how is that able to gain any teeth or momentum or whatever the phrase is. You understand what I'm asking you?
Well, it's always been the Palestinian narrative, so anyone sympathizing with them would adopt that.
But how? But
also, by the way, at some point we should mention the entire regional situation, but we can get to that. We can back into that later.
Whenever you want to fold that in, I'm open and flexible.
But yeah, on the narrative front, it's not a complete fabrication. Certainly, when you have a bunch of the early Aliyah from of Israeli settlers into, or Israeli Zionists into the Holy Land, they were coming from Russia and Europe, and the Palestinians ultimately, much of their world was destroyed. Half their population was ethnically cleansed from what became Israel. They're still refugees, they and their descendants, refugees to this day. You can kind of selectively pick out that history and say, okay, Israel is a settler colonial state, except the fact that the Jews are both biologically, religiously, spiritually, on every front connected to that land, have always had to maintain the connection. The roots of Zionism are the centuries of persecution suffered primarily in Europe and Russia that led to that movement. And then, okay, where do we need to go? Where should we go? We should go to the land that we have a fundamental connection to, because there were alternatives considered.
By the way, prior to the formation of the Islamic faith, right? So when you say spiritually connected, I'm just saying.
But I mean, I don't think that ultimately matters who was there first or not. I mean, also Palestinians are also genetically and fundamentally connected to this land, going back to before Islam.
Okay.
Both sides have. This is one of the tragedies of the conflict: is both sides have legitimate claims to the land, or one of the elements that leads to the tragedy. And they also, by
Okay.
the way, are genetically connected between the two of them.
Oh, so it's sort of fratricidal tragedy because you're saying
In terms
independent
of
of.
its, yeah, in terms of going all the way back. I mean,
Mhm.
often, sometimes they are referred to as like uh, the two sons of Abraham, you know.
Mhm.
But anyway, um, I got distracted because my headphones are dying, so I may have to go off them at some moment. Yeah, okay, the if you look at the history, so Jews were escaping persecution in Europe. You know, oftentimes they were told, "Go to Palestine." You could see the graffiti on the wall. Go to Palestine. This is before the Holocaust. Events leading up to the Holocaust, and the Holocaust itself supercharged that immigration. And by the way, I mean, the original settlers in the land, they purchased the land. It's not like they just went in and took land away from Palestinians. And there were many efforts made to live alongside each other. Now, you can understand from at that time, it's debatable how much they were one Palestinian polity. You know, there were Arabs that were under the Ottoman Empire at that time. It would also come from other places historically. Really, the Palestinian identity, much like the Israeli identity, was created or came about in the wake of Israel's formation. But leading up to that, there were, you know, the Palestinians, the Arabs who were there, knew that the Jews coming in wanted to have their own state, a Jewish state uh, inside of the historic land of Israel. There were various ideas among Zionists of what form that would take, how much territory that would be. You know, eventually the control after World War I was under the British control of that land. I won't go step by step through all the things that happened, but you know, you had increasing violence between the two sides. You had a major, it's called the Arab Revolt in the late 30s, which really was a big part of what the beginning of the conflict. You had massacres like in Hebron around that time, or even before that, and you know, Jews began building their own defense organizations as well as like a state in waiting. And you had international legitimacy for a Jewish state, because eventually the UN came out with a partition plan that, again, this is international law, you know, whereas both sides would receive their own state. The Israelis accepted it, or the Jewish state called the Yishuv at the time accepted it. The Arab Palestinians did not. The Jewish side launched a preemptive kind of attack against them, committed massacres themselves. Then the Arab states, as soon as Israel was ratified as a country by the UN, launched their own multi-pronged attack against Israel, which Israel eventually won. That was the War for Independence. And, you know, under that, Israel is a state under international law. So, you know, this is one of the hypocrisies you see on the left is like, okay, we want to say Israel is an illegal settler colonial state, which is, well, that's contrary to international law. The same international law that you cite in terms of Israel's actions in the West Bank and elsewhere as being against international law makes Israel a legal state. But Israel doesn't have a hard and fast border that they've ever drawn because of the ongoing conflicts with their neighbors.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in terms of with the Palestinian narrative, you know, after or during the War for Independence, there were roughly half of the Palestinian population, 750,000, were either expelled or left their homes throughout what became Israel. And Israel either took over or destroyed these villages. and that's referred to as the Nakba by Palestinians, the catastrophe in Arabic. And so you see, I mean, like if you think about Palestinians in Gaza, they a majority of them are descendants of refugees from inside Israel. They can look into Israel and see Sderot, which is a major Israeli city that was built on top of a Palestinian city. They see Ashkelon to the north, also built on top of a Palestinian village. So you understand that their narrative doesn't come from nothing.
Yes, yes. I really appreciate, you kind of mentioned earlier in our conversation, not buying into any one extreme of the polarity and not subscribing to black and white thinking and saying, look, differing perspectives are valid for these reasons, because when you put yourself in the shoes of, if you have appreciation and knowledge of history and context, then it's not out of left field, and it's not totally it's not coming from nothing. So I appreciate you taking the time to lay that out and describe the perspective of why that narrative can carry water, carry weight. Again, because how I'm coming at this is literally maybe coming from a more first of all, much less informed perspective than yours. That's very obvious. But just from the long lens and thinking about literally, maybe it's a rigid way of thinking about it, but it is literally kind of like I touched that Oreo cookie first. It's mine. Not to make light of it, but just it's oversimplifying it, I guess, to say, oh, well, how are we talking about Palestinians as being indigenous? Like, weren't the Jews driven out of Egypt and had, sought refuge in these lands since, again, before Islam was even a religion? But your rebuttal, or your what you offered there, really does help me and perhaps listeners have more of an appreciation for why, not only why you can understand that perspective, but also why they're so interlinked and hard to solve. There's a reason why this conflict hasn't been solved yet,
Mm-hmm.
And I spoke earlier about the problem solver part of me and the healer that wants to come into, if we do take these two peoples as genetic brothers, essentially, how can we? It's always going to just go forever and ever if we're just trying to say okay, well, you wronged us more, so we need to get you back. It's the kind of ethics of the recess of the playground, like the moral reasoning of an elementary schooler, and that's not tenable at all. So you have. So I'm you were working for an organization that is explicitly trying to help the mission of a two-state solution coming into being. And then the events of October 7th happen, as you said earlier, the worst day in the history of the Israeli state. How are you thinking about it? How do you have hope for a two-state solution these days?
Well, and can you hear me okay? Because I went off my
yeah, I can hear you just fine. Yeah.
It wasn't the most hopeful situation
prior
before that, and it's only since I've been involved professionally in this become less hopeful overall. But at the end of the day, it's really because it's kind of the only solution. There are various forms a two-state solution could take, but at the end of the day, you have to have, since both sides have legitimate claims to the land, since both sides are there and not going anywhere, you have to find a way for them to live together and to resolve these fundamental issues that are between them. And at the end of the day, it really takes this is a term that's used a lot in this conflict, political will to make it happen. You know, the organization I worked for in Israel, which is a joint Israeli-Palestinian organization based in Tel Aviv and in Ramallah, called the Geneva Initiative. This was launched in 2003 with a, you know, incredibly detailed plan written by and based on consultations with a huge variety of Israeli and Palestinian experts and people involved in negotiations and various efforts over the years. And it's, you know, down to the most minute detail, lays out how a two-state solution can work, how to resolve the core issues, you know, referred to as final status issues between the two sides. And it's all there. I mean, you can adjust, you know, with official negotiators, certain things, but elements like how the land would be divided would have to be resolved in negotiations. But what it really takes is the leadership that's willing to make it happen. And often, you know, there's a theory that you have to have two of the three major leadership elements aligned in terms of wanting a two-state solution. The triangle being Israel, Palestinians, and the US. So a president that's willing to put the political capital, dedicate the amount of political capital necessary to make something like this happen. An Israeli side that wants a two-state solution, and a Palestinian side that wants a two-state solution. Well, on the Israeli side, we've had Netanyahu for all these years, who obviously does not want a two-state solution. On the Palestinian side, you've had a divided polity between a corrupt and feeble Palestinian Authority and a Hamas-led Gaza that's explicitly opposed to Israel's existence. And then on the US side, nobody willing to dedicate the amount of political capital necessary to resolve something this intractable. I mean, obviously under Obama, there were major initiatives, but he was not prepared really to go all the way in the way necessary to make it happen. Even if he did, who knows whether he could have, because you didn't have either one of the other two elements prepared for it.
Mm-hmm.
And for a lot of the years, you could make the case that it wasn't even in the US's interest to dedicate that amount of political capital to this issue. I think that's one thing that's changed with October 7th, because it's demonstrated the volatility of the issue and how it affects so many other elements. It's affecting domestic US politics. Biden's approval level among Democrats has gone down significantly in certain sectors, among young people, among Arab Americans, because of his support for Israel. You see, you know, this taking attention away from efforts in Ukraine and elsewhere. And that, of course, then the regional situation I was talking about. So you have the war in Gaza, which was caused by October 7th. You have increasing violence in the West Bank. As a result of that, you had the low-level front that opened up on Israel's northern border with Hezbollah, who started launching missiles into Israel. Israel has been responding, and there are something like 80,000 Israelis who have been evacuated from communities in the north of Israel. That's in addition to all the Israelis who've been evacuated from the south. And that
evacuated where? To Lebanon?
Evacuated into central Israel from north of Israel.
Okay.
Away from the border with Hezbollah, with Lebanon, where these attacks have been occurring. So that's putting major strain on Israeli society and on the state, in addition to the war. And, you know, that could blow up. And there's, you know, the reporting was that actually Netanyahu's government, we should talk about the makeup of his government, wanted, Netanyahu and the defense minister wanted to preemptively start a war with Lebanon to take out Hezbollah, even in the midst of the war with Gaza, when they were restrained by both us, the US, and the other political elements that came in to join his unity government, the war cabinet. So there's that. There's also what's happening in the Red Sea with the Houthi militia in Yemen, who have been disrupting maritime traffic in the Red Sea ever since Israel started responding after October 7th, claiming that they're just attacking Israeli ships, but it's been well beyond that, and it's leading to major supply chain disruptions in many parts of the world. And of course, now you have a U.S.-led coalition, U.S. and UK-led coalition that's responding to that by bombing the Houthis in Yemen. And Houthis are an Iranian-backed actor, as is Hezbollah, as is Hamas. And, Hamas also has a presence, a military presence inside Lebanon. They've launched rockets from there, as well as other figures in various other countries. Their leadership is in Qatar, which is playing a mediating role, trying to, as far as between Israel and Hamas, as well as Egypt, and coming to ceasefire agreement and release of hostages. And then you have these attacks against American bases that have been responsive by, again, Iranian-backed actors, including just this week, one that killed 3 Americans, which crosses another line and gets us closer to a larger conflagration. And so, of course, Israel has been also bombing Syria for years, primarily taking out armaments meant for Hezbollah that are coming from Iran-backed actors, Syrian government, another Iran-backed actor. Israel also bombed Lebanon, has bombed Lebanon both in response to issues at the border, but also had an assassination of a major Hamas figure a few weeks ago inside of Beirut using a drone. So that's just that's kind of a synopsis of the whole regional issue, which threatens to explode.
Yeah, that's what you mentioned earlier, that we should touch on the regional, and especially given the news this week. And I remember hearing about that and just being like, even in mid-October, being like, oh God, what fate will this befall? Not just the locals, but the whole international community. Regarding, like, people were throwing out the term World War III.
Also affects the whole thing, affects the U.S. standing in the region. According to polling, the U.S. is at a low point. That's the lowest point in terms of public opinion since the Iraq War, because people sympathize with the Palestinians, and there's plenty in terms of the genocide in Gaza thing that you mentioned. And I'm firmly against that terminology, and it's not a genocide, but because Israel is not, despite some of the comments by people in Israel's government, which I said we should get to, Israel is not carrying out a campaign of wiping out Palestinians. But I think you can criticize Israel's conduct in the war in terms of how it relaxed standards for collateral damage, its use of AI technology in generating targets, and as far as the collateral damage, willing to kill 100 or so civilians and to take out one Hamas commander who's not even necessarily that high up. Kind of especially in the early days, clearly an anger-fueled campaign, and also kind of a saving face by the military campaign.
I mean, if I could just jump in, when you're a military strategist, I don't know what choice you have. I don't. Obviously, you want to be able to resolve things without violence, but if your quote unquote enemy is using civilians to hide behind, how do you get it done?
Then what I'm saying, I'm not saying that you have no collateral damage.
Right. Yeah.
You accept that some civilians can or will be killed, but the question is how many civilians. And if you look at Israel's standards over the years, it used to be much stricter. In fact, there were incidents that caused major upheaval in Israeli society that even a small amount of civilians were killed as far as an assassination of a major Hamas figure. And that's continually, I think Palestinians have been continually dehumanized in Israeli society, that both sides dehumanize the other, and willing to just, you've seen a lot of people say there are no innocents in Gaza and the entire area should be flattened, things like that. That's predominant in Israeli society, not just even among the right wing. But Israel's not carrying out a campaign of genocide. But you can criticize its actions, and and I think the U.S. has been making efforts largely behind the scenes. But even with some of the statements Biden has made, as far as limiting civilian deaths, Biden even used the term indiscriminate warfare. And it's true that we do have a double standard for Israel as an ally than we take towards our adversaries like Russia and their conduct in Ukraine. It's not so simple,
Yeah, you mentioned. Thanks for sharing all that, Aaron. You mentioned wanting to talk specifically about Netanyahu's administration or the actors in the Israeli government, and I'm not sure we touched on that to the degree that you wanted.
They've certainly helped fuel the charges of genocide when you have major figures saying these kinds of things. Their statements were cited at the International Court of Justice, when they ruled that Israel, could be carrying out a campaign of genocide. It was a preliminary ruling, and kind of put Israel on notice. But basically, there were over a number of years, a couple of years. When I was in Israel, there were 3 different elections occurred just in the time I was there, because Netanyahu couldn't maintain a government. He had lost support among major sectors of Israeli society, including among center right, I guess you could say, because of his corruption and his corruption scandals, which then led to him being indicted. And so he was unable to outright win any election or to win a clear election that allowed him to put together a coalition. So his government kept falling, or he couldn't form a government, or he would form short-lived governments with people from the other side, from outside his natural coalition, you could say. And eventually he was able, I guess this was early, I'm forgetting timelines, but I think 2023, able to form a government with a comfortable coalition of few seats, 3 or 4 seats. He was able to do this by empowering and joining forces with elements of the far right in Israel. These are people who, the most extremist elements, who have been committed of, some of them, the leader of one party, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's now the head of Israel's police, was previously convicted of terrorism. He first came to prominence around the time of the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, because he ripped off Mercedes-Benz logo of his official car and said, if we can get to his car, we can get to him. This guy. And then he became a lawyer and was representing Jewish terrorists in court, and then a political figure, and now he's the head of this party on the far right. But Netanyahu, because he needed this element to give him enough seats, he made sure that they united in order to have enough seats to get into government, and then he brought them into his coalition. and now they are linchpin to him maintaining power, and they're dictating a lot of his actions because he doesn't want to lose them. He doesn't want them to if they leave government, then his government falls. And he is thinking in a lot of ways and mirrors Trump's situation, that he, in his mind, has to maintain power in order to save himself on the legal front. This is what occurred prior to October 7th, where you had major upheaval, almost unprecedented in Israeli society, because once this government came into power, the whole effort was to have this major judicial reform, which was referred to by its critics, that I agree with, as a judicial coup, to limit the power of the courts, limit the power of the Supreme Court, allow basically the end result that would allow Netanyahu to cancel his trials and get off and not go to prison. And he gave these major concessions and brought in these far right elements in order to achieve this. So this led to these huge protests in Israel that were going on for months and months, massive amount of Israelis, and huge rifts in Israeli society, including Israeli reservists refusing to serve. And they were warned, the government was warned, this is hurting Israel's deterrence, because we're distracted, we're dealing with this, and morale is low and this kind of thing. And then Israel's enemies saw this, and it's not a coincidence that Hamas chose that moment to launch October 7th.
Right. Yeah, I think about how difficult that is with the incentive, with how fucked up the incentives are when you talk about Netanyahu and Trump and saying the way I protect myself, like my incentives are to protect myself. If I do the right thing, kind of the morally right thing for the betterment of the greater good, the greater society, if we just, the greater good being limited to one government, one country, that means I'm up Schitt's Creek, So the idea that like the incentives are so misaligned that people are going to make a deal with the devil and say, well, I can't lose power, so I'm going to make these compromises, and I'm associating to what you were talking about Netanyahu prior to, it's like, well, we just have to deal with this. The phrase was mow the lawn, or we just have to deal with this. And it's just, it seems blind, I guess. It's lacking a higher perspective.
They both only care about themselves above the country at this point. I mean, difference between Trump and Netanyahu is Trump fundamentally only cares about himself, whereas Netanyahu, at this point, he's prioritizing his own needs above everything else, but he is also fundamentally an ideologue. His opposition to a two-state solution comes from an ideological place regarding Israel's security and right-wing ideology in general. So there's fundamentally some different motivations, but they are in very similar situations and behaving very similarly.
Well, I'm just the phrase that keeps knocking around in my head is play stupid games, win stupid prizes, and the philosophy of good and evil, of like, there does seem to be a structure of reality, whereas if you act in morally suspicious ways, or not suspicious, that's not the word I want to use, but like that there's a price that you pay for not doing the right thing, and that price, I'm terribly oversimplifying here, but like that price can be vast, so again, like just with this idea of like the locus of attention is self-preservation, you know what I mean? Like that's not is that the right thing? It's like only to the selfish parts of an ego complex, you know what I mean? Like that want to protect itself versus what is the right thing to do. I don't know. I'm diving below politics. I would even dive below psychology and go into, I don't know, philosophical ethics or spirituality, or just
we can talk about things like, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? If I'm not for the other, who will be for them? I forget, I'm butchering that phrase, but like you have to find a way to balance these things. And again, returning to Israeli society, again, October 7th is primarily to be blamed on Hamas, but you had the situation where the thought was we can just keep living with a perpetual occupation and doing nothing about it. That the kind of like silver lining, I don't like to use the word silver lining, but something positive you can take from a horrible situation is that in conflicts in general, and particularly this one, the theory goes that you have to have a herding stalemate in order to get to peace. That means that both sides have to be hurting to a point where they're willing to make major sacrifices. The major peace initiatives that were launched in the 90s were on the heels of the first Intifada, where there was uprising in Arabic, where Palestinians rose up against occupation, and that's when Hamas first came to be a terrorist group and conducted attacks against Israel, not just Hamas, but other actors, terrorist actors as well. And some of the initiatives of the early 2000s were on the heels of the second Intifada, which was much more violent than the first. Now, October 7th, in one day, killed more Israelis than the entire second Intifada. And I can tell you, having lived in Israel, no one ever thought that it would return to anything like the second Intifada in terms of the amount of casualties on the Israeli side. And you see, obviously, if you go into the West Bank, if you're in anything in Jerusalem, you see the occupation or elements of the occupation. Certainly when you're driving on Israel's major highways, you can see the wall there. You see Palestinian communities on the other side, but you can largely have a day-to-day existence inside Israel that ignores the occupation, ignores any kind of direct effects of it, other than the periodic wars. So people thought, you can live this way, and if you can, talking about blinders, if you can put those blinders on and not have to make any major sacrifices, then why are you going to do it? Especially when major sectors of society and people who are in power have not just an interest in not doing it, but are explicitly against doing it.
Yeah. Well, again, it's the word incentives come to mind, and I keep getting fixated on the forces that drive the choices of leadership, the forces that drive, like if you trace back all of the violence and suffering that's happened, and you trace it back, where's its origin point? What's driving it?
And we should definitely talk about Jerusalem. There are, when you talk about final status issues, certainly the division of the land, settlements, resources, primarily water, the refugee issue, these are all major elements. But one thing that drives decisions and violence, a lot of the Palestinian violence in particular, are things that happen in Jerusalem, and in particular regarding the Temple Mount, or the noble sanctuary in Islam, Haram al-Sharif. This is, the area where the Second Temple once existed, and today you have the Al-Aqsa Mosque, as well as the Dome of the Rock, right in the heart of Jerusalem, in the heart of the old city of Jerusalem. This is the area that is, the Western Wall, the holiest site in Judaism. The Temple Mount itself is the holiest site, and then the Western Wall is a retaining wall for the platform on which the Second Temple was built, destroyed by the Romans over 2,000 years ago. It was the beginning of the exodus of Jews from the Holy Land. And eventually 2 mosques were built there, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, Dome of the Rock. It became an element of Islamic theology that's where Muhammad ascended to heaven from, and that the entire area is actually considered a mosque in Islam. It is also governed by by Jordan, basically a Jordanian authority called the Waqf. So when you're on the Temple Mount, these are the people you see, but you also see Israeli border police that at any time can act to quell violence or sometimes initiate their own violence, and who also guard the entrances to the Temple Mount. So you have incidents that occur all the time, and these can lead Israel's actions on and around the Temple Mount often lead to violence by Palestinians. It's no coincidence that the name for the October 7th attack given by Hamas was the Al-Aqsa Flood. They claim that the final preparations for this attack started after Israel was taking certain actions on the Temple Mount. In particular, after this far-right government came to power, Itamar Ben-Gvir, this nationalist far-right guy, went up to the Temple Mount and said, this is going to be a place where Jews can come freely and pray. Now, in your mind, you think, well, why shouldn't Jews be able to go up to the holiest site in Judaism and be able to pray? Because there's a thing called the status quo. This was agreed to by Israel after the 1967 war, when Israel took over all of Jerusalem, took over the holy sites and the Temple Mount, in which the Waqf would control the areas, Israel would control the area around it. Muslims would be given unimpeded access to the Temple Mount. Jews only can come through one specific entrance right by the Western Wall in limited amounts, and they wouldn't be able to openly pray on the Temple Mount because that leads to fears of Jewish takeover of the Temple Mount, which some people over the years have explicitly wanted. Some people in the initial conquering, and then afterwards there was something called the Jewish Underground, a Jewish terrorist movement that tried to bomb the Al-Aqsa Mosque. In the Second Intifada is also called the Al-Aqsa Intifada. It started in the wake of Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, Israeli Prime Minister, going up to the Temple Mount to make a symbolic statement. It's more complicated than that, but that certainly kicked off the violence that led to the Second Intifada. So it's intricately connected, and it always threatens to turn what is really a conflict about land and people's rights to that land into a religious conflict, a zero-sum conflict.
Well, apparently zero-sum. Apparently.
Well, in the mind of those who would conduct it as a religious conflict.
Right. But again, this is where we need so much more time. We shouldn't have expected to cover vast amounts of this issue in just 90 minutes. But we're only beginning to scratch the surface where your level of expertise and talking about the politics of it, international relations, the history, and we're now getting into the spiritual, like fundamentally this thing cannot resolve itself unless you have the wisdom traditions of the Israeli people and the wisdom traditions of the Palestinians to be able to shape share. Here's this it's going to sound very wacky, but in my view, the human behavior at the level of the individual, and then the interconnected nature of human beings being social organisms, we are driven by emotions, and that sounds psychological, but where it gets spiritual is, I would say, we can conceptualize emotions as spirits. And the human beings think Shakespeare, think like a Shakespearean. It's like, all the world's a stage and we're just the players, man. We're just the fucking actors. I'm not saying we're puppets, and I'm not going to go on a diatribe about determinism and free will, but essentially the meat bodies that are having all of the conflict over the millennia, okay, are driven by spirits. And you just use the term zero sum, which means we can't broker peace between these wisdom traditions, because the spirits can't learn how to share. And until the spirits learn how to share, the humans will be helplessly strung up like puppets for the next centuries to come and millennia to come. So I just don't see how, maybe you can broker peace. Maybe you could have a two-state solution, but it's not going to last. It's unless you have the spirits get along. That's my point. And again, it sounds fucking woo-woo, and we don't have the time to unpack it. But
like I said, some of the fundamental to that sharing is sacrifice by both sides. I mean,
yes.
When I just talked about Temple Mount and Jews not being able to pray on Temple Mount, you could look at that, and that's also why I was kind of cautioning against viewing the situation as like, we were here first and they came after. They obviously, Islamic rulers of that area explicitly built those mosques on the Temple Mount to lay claim to that as a religious area,
which humans have been doing forever.
Well
before this.
And also the Arab populations. I mean, the area was conquered over and over again over centuries, over millennia, by various different peoples. There was human migration throughout this period. Arab populations that are there now, a lot of them came from other areas of the Middle East. But that doesn't really matter. These people have hundreds of years of history there. They have a deep connection to the land, and legitimate claims to it, and have rights to it under international law and the current international system we have, which isn't dictated by the Bible. But so Jews have to be willing to give up the Temple Mount as the idea of building a third temple, and accept the Western Wall, while at the same time Palestinians have to be willing to accept there's a strong current, probably among a majority of Palestinians, I think it's shown in polling, the denial of Jewish history in Jerusalem and land in general, to the Temple Mount as well, all connected to the conflict, and there has to be an acceptance of reality. And you see this even among people who are willing to accept Israel's existence, like Mahmoud Abbas, who even in the past year has given a speech where he denies Jewish history and says, old anti-Semitic canards. So, and at the end of the day, like, maybe you're not going to change this in the mind of a lot of people, but they have to be willing to accept a reality where you're sharing the land and are giving things up. And it's not going to be perfect, and you're going to have to accept sharing that land with people that have victimized you. Both sides are victims and victimizers.
Yeah, that's right, and that's a very hard thing to. So you mentioned sacrifice, and that there's intergenerational wounding on each side, and there's a spiritual significance on each side. And again, I hang out in the weirder fucking waters, And so it might just feel like semantics here, but like you say, the people have to get along. And in my view, it's the spirits that drive the people that have to get along. And again, you're not going to have international discourse is not gonna speak that way. So why take that view? But in my view, it is a deeper perspective, and it respects the things that are essential inside of the people who are perpetually in conflict with one another. So to not radically, but to wholly respect the person, everything inside of them, not just their role as a leader or their role as a childless father or mother, but to respect the totality of them, including the spirit that says, no, I don't want to share. No, I'm not willing to make that sacrifice. No, you've been killing my ancestors, right? You have to, I say you, but one has to figure out how to use the language that can move the spirit inside of the person, that spirit is then voluntarily saying, okay, I will give permission. Okay, I will sacrifice. I'll allow it. But until you can reach someone at that deep level, I just don't. And I have hope. You have to have hope. But in my view, finding peace has to dip below the structure of international politics, and indeed below the structure of psychology, and behavioral incentives.
That's called track 2 dialogue, where you have this outside of governments not on a geopolitical level. You have between.
I've never heard of track 2. Can you say a little bit more?
Well, they led by various NGOs or like grassroots groups. You've had this for many years throughout the conflict, people-to-people peace building initiatives, and there's always a debate about which has to happen first. And a lot of the basis on which the Oslo Accords were agreed, which was that you would build up a level of trust between the two sides that would lead to peace. I think to some level that's been disproven that you need that. I think you need them simultaneous, but I don't think you have to achieve a certain level of people-to-people peace building success in order to get to a geopolitical resolution. I think you need that resolution so that you can stop the violence, at least widespread violence, because you're still going to have people that split off. I mean, you look at like Northern Ireland and other conflicts, there's still lingering violence and dissidents. But when you have the vast majority of two sides living under a situation that is not inherently violent, then you can have those reconciliation efforts over years without the drivers of why you need those reconciliation efforts still occurring simultaneously. And so that spiritual element, that more human element, is definitely a fundamental element. And I've been part of some of those initiatives professionally, and I encourage them. I just don't think they're a prerequisite, and I think you can get to a geopolitical resolution without reaching a certain level of track 2 dialogue. But track 2 dialogue can come in various forms. It's also just, you can have it related to the more geopolitical agreement, but just between non-state actors. But yeah, I mean, there are many groups that conduct these efforts, and including one called Combatants for Peace, which connects people who have been killed or families of those killed, families of Israeli soldiers or families of terrorists, or even the soldiers or terrorists who change their ways themselves, coming together to learn empathy for the other side
and heal together.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, I'm actually conflating two different groups. There's Combatants for Peace, which is the latter one, and also what's it called? I can't think of the name right now, but the grieving families of people who have suffered on both sides coming together.
Yeah.
Family council, family circle.
Yeah.
And you also have, NGOs inside of Israel that help Palestinians, people that volunteer to drive Palestinians to Israeli hospitals, things like that. And that, one of the ironies of October 7th, this is not true for every area around Gaza inside Israel. This area is called the Gaza envelope, which is inside Israel around Gaza. But many of the kibbutzim that were attacked are very progressive. Some of the most progressive people inside of Israel live there. People are very sympathetic to Palestinians' plight. People who helped either Arabs inside Israel or even Palestinians who employed Palestinians from Gaza. And then people who would in some cases be against the war entirely, but certainly against this rhetoric that you're hearing from major figures in Israeli society about there being no innocence among Palestinians.
Right.
And these people were living on the front line and suffered, this horrible fate. And then now they're being used as pawns to just further the conflict more and lead to more death and destruction. And of course, hatred that will last for generations. Which is why I think at this point, I think while I think the war is a just war and a just response by Israel, despite what you can criticize its conduct in a number of areas, I think at this point, it's best to reach a ceasefire. I think that we reached that point a little while ago, both in terms of like the diminishing returns of the campaign. Israel laid out the government laid out the goal of complete destruction of Hamas, which is never going to happen. Hamas is a movement, an ideology, and
Can I speak to that?
Well, just let me just like cover all these things. And as people live, a lot of its leadership is outside the country, so that was never going to happen. The tunnel network is, we're talking about now. They've discovered something like 450 miles of tunnels when they thought it was like 250 before the war, all under a territory that's the size of New Jersey. That's like 25 miles at its longest. So even at this point, they've only destroyed roughly about 20% of the tunnels. So they're never going to destroy all the tunnels. The amount of considering the civilian death toll inside Gaza, considering what it's doing to Israel's image abroad, the U.S. image abroad, and of course the hostages who are, living a horrible situation. How many of them are even living, we don't know. To get them out and to start a process that can lead to stabilization, that can lead to some sort of track towards a more hopeful future, I think is necessary now. But it can't just be a unilateral, like a lot of these, the left wants just to ceasefire now, just declare ceasefire and pull out. And like, as if like Hamas is just going to be like, okay, we're cool, we're not going to attack you anymore.
That ceasefire was where we were on October 6th.
Exactly. So it has to be a mutually agreed ceasefire in which there's major fundamental change inside of Gaza, something that leads to some element of the Palestinian Authority reassuming rule there, although it can't just assume rule on the back of an Israeli tank. And leading to people there being, because people, the UN a month ago said that 25% of Gazans are currently starving. They're living in huge refugee camps. As I said, the civilian death toll is terrible. The amount of women and children who have died is terrible.
It's hell on earth.
There's obviously the way that people were killed on October 7th and the widespread rape and other actions were horrible. The way that people are dying in Gaza is also horrible. Imagine a child slowly dying under rubble. That's obviously horrific. So if there's a way to bring, that to an end in which we don't have the seeds of immediate violence on our hands, in which Hamas is fundamentally change its organization, either through expulsion of its leaders, demilitarization, and the longer conversation about Hamas and the certain differences between its political leadership abroad and its leadership inside Gaza. But there are some prospects for splitting Hamas in that way, or for fundamentally changing it in its role in the conflict.
Yeah. I just want to say the total destruction of Hamas. The first time I heard that phrase, destruction is one flavor of transformation. It's like, why do people ask for destruction? It's because they want to transform what is there. They don't want a threat. They don't want people with ill will towards their loved ones, to themselves and their loved ones. They want sovereignty. They want safety. But destruction doesn't have to be the form of transformation to reach the same end. So and again, I might just sound like I'm just bickering over semantics here, but I'm like, I am inclined not to destroying running the experiment. How many iterations of we're going to destroy it, and then there's retaliation. They destroy us, we destroy them, they destroy us. It's just the itchy and scratchy. They just get bigger. It just never ends. It just gets bigger, bigger. Escalates. Right? It's like, how about some healing? You can transform someone by healing them, and you can heal them when you have the safety, which is obviously the region is lacking, but healing happens with safety, with humility, with curiosity, with patience, with a willingness to listen. So you don't give in to the extreme, polarization belief systems and narratives, and you treat someone with respect. And again, you can't do that when someone's hostile towards you. That seems impossible. So I totally get why the call is, we need nothing less than the complete and total destruction of Hamas. And I look at that and I'm just like, you're buying yourself. Save that receipt, because you're going to need to, you're going to connect that to the next generation's suffering and ongoing conflict in perpetuity when you just wipe, I don't know. It's
important to remember. I mean, obviously, you're not going to change the ideology of Hamas leadership or most of its people involved in Hamas, but it's also important to remember that Hamas strategy rests on Israel conducting itself in a lot of ways that it has, in terms of, and this is always true of guerrilla warfare, that you respond in an asymmetric way, and a lot of civilians are killed. And Hamas, there's a reason why they build a lot of command centers and tunnels under hospitals and schools and mosques, because they know that the destruction of those will lead to international sympathy. They know already how much of the world sympathizes with Palestinians, and the part of the strategy is capitalizing on the visible deaths of Palestinians, Palestinian children, and innocents, that being broadcast to the world, and gaining sympathy from that. They say this explicitly, and Israel often is all too willing to help them in this way, in terms of its dehumanization of Palestinians and the way it conducts itself in the occupation and in warfare. And it all, again, just leads to more and more generations that have experienced this pain that will, seed their hatred forever in many cases. So that's why I'm saying you're not going to be able to necessarily overcome that and then get to a peace agreement. You have to have the peace, and then you can work from there to overcome the hatred.
Yeah. Well, we need 3 more hours. At least I know this won't be the last time we talk about it, but I am deeply grateful to you for coming on and sharing your knowledge and this conversation with our listeners. So thanks for coming on the show, Aaron. And we'll do it again.
Thanks for having me.